Good morning, old friends. Good morning, new friends. As Matt indicated, I do now live and work in Las Vegas. I'm not Elvis. I see him on a fairly regular basis at a bus stop near where I get coffee in the morning. I don't have a slot machine in my living room. It's in my daughter's room. I find it more convenient to go in there. Living in Vegas is a very, very interesting thing to do, an interesting place. Is anybody here from Vegas? You can say so if you are. It doesn't actually have to stay there, I found out. Well, it's great to be back. As Matt said, I worked for the U.S. Olympic Committee for a number of years. Before that, I worked for two of our national governing bodies. I worked for USA Hockey and USA Wrestling, and have a great appreciation for the work that you all do and the importance of it. For those of you that are relatively new to the digital social media space, I have some great news. You will never in your life encounter a less technologically capable person than me. So feel very at ease, and my PowerPoint presentation will probably validate just how bad my technological skills are. But what I'd like to do is talk a bit about what's going on in our world today, maybe make sense of it a bit, and translate that into how you can use what you've learned here, the great advice you've gotten about the power of digital and social media, to make your case to sponsors, to make your case to the media, to translate all of this into expanded growth for your programs and ultimately for the sport. I know many of us in here are just young enough to remember these lyrics from Harry Nilsson. I think it's applicable to what sports editors and marketers face today, and that is this absolute wave of everybody talking to them and they can't hear a single word any of us are saying. So hopefully as we go through today, I'll be able to give you some suggestions on how you can cut through all of that noise, and it is very, very noisy out there. And again, get the attention you deserve for your programs with the media, and also attract greater support from corporate sponsors. Our world is changing faster than ever before, and the 4-year-old of today, who was born in 2011, will likely not know the joys of any of these wonderful things that we all knew. They'll never go to Blockbuster. They won't know the fun of trying to fold up a paper map in a car while driving, probably a good thing. They won't know what a fax machine is other than that dusty relic in the corner of the room. They'll know what a watch is, but primarily as a jewelry item or an accessory, not as a utility tool. They won't know what encyclopedias are, newspaper classifieds. The yellow and white pages won't exist for them. CDs they probably won't recognize. They don't know what long distance phone service is, cameras that take film, handwritten letters. Sadly, a child born in 2011 probably won't know what those are, and the evening news. There are some good things, though, that they will know. They'll know lifelong friendships. What digital and social media do for us today is wonderful, and one of those things is it allows young people, all of us really, to maintain relationships with people that extend not just by our proximity to one another physically, but our ability to stay connected digitally and socially. So those are just interesting things that the 4-year-old who will be in your program in just a few years will not encounter as we all did in our lifetime. Our world's getting very, very crowded. We're living longer. That same child born in 2011 is expected to live as an average 78.8 years. Now, for many demographics in our country, that life expectancy is actually significantly longer. That's 4 years longer than their parents, who were born in 1980, and more than a decade longer than their grandparents, who were born in 1950. And you can see that our global population in 35 years will have almost doubled. There has been no period in history where our world has grown this much, this fast. There is something a bit sobering in all of this, though, and I think it's a challenge that we should all take very, very seriously. And I hate to introduce sort of a heavy, somber note to all of this, but it is an important one, and that is the generation coming up today is the first generation in the history of our country whose quality of life is expected to not be as good as the generation that preceded it, which is to say, every generation in America has enjoyed a higher quality of life than the generation before. We can reverse that, and as leaders of local swim clubs and as leaders of programs that have such a profound impact on the lives of young people and their families, please take that challenge very, very seriously. We owe it to the generation that's coming up today to not let that be the first generation that has a lower standard of living, a lower quality of life than the generation before it. We've heard this morning about the demographic shift that is expected to take place in our country, not just now, we know it's taking place, but playing that out to 2060. And you see how our country looks today in terms of population and percentages, and how our country is expected to look in 2060. And really the stat I would point to there is that in 2060, non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic Caucasians will be in a position where it is not the minority group, or the majority group rather, in our country. That's very, very different, and something I know USA Swimming and all of you are mindful of, the fact that America is changing very, very quickly. That presents great opportunity. I think it also presents great responsibility for all of us. It's also worth knowing that child born in 2011, by 2060, will see a very different world economically. China and India, by 2060, and in fact ahead of 2060, I believe, will be the economic superpower of the world. And the economic and ultimately the political might that those two countries will wield will be significant. This will have a profound impact on our country and the way we all do what we do, whether it's business at the highest levels or business in our neighborhoods and communities. So, with all of that, what does this mean for media, which is where, as Matt indicated, I've spent much of my career working in media relations, and now I do a bit of sponsorship work as well. Well, traditional media in the way we all know it is changing as rapidly as our world is. And you can see that social media, which we've heard so much about, really, really good information over the last 24 hours. Social media use grew by more than 225% from 2009 to 2012. You see there the percentage of adults who engage with social media in 2009 more than tripled by 2012. That will continue. 42% of adults today see the internet as their primary source of entertainment. Not just cat videos, those are fantastic, but there's a lot of other things they go to the internet for right now. Netflix, companies like that. That's why blockbuster, traditional forms of media and entertainment that we all grew up with are becoming extinct very, very quickly. And the newspaper industry, which is sort of the foundation of what many of us think about when we think about media. I'm not ready to declare it dead yet, but it's on a fast track to not being around a whole lot longer. How's that for gently saying that the newspaper industry is in trouble? Print advertising revenue is down by close to 50% over where it was in 2006. And since 2008, more than 120 daily newspapers in the United States have closed and gone away. I had the good fortune, as Matt indicated, of working in London for 4 years, which I didn't know it at the time, but to my way of thinking is sort of the last great thriving media market in the world. We had roughly 14 daily newspapers in London alone, and I saw something during my 4 years there that I don't know we'll see in the United States anytime soon, and that is the birth of a new daily newspaper, and it actually survived. I don't think you would see that happen in the United States now, and I don't think you're going to see that happen anytime soon. This industry is changing very, very quickly, and for those of us who think about getting coverage in newspapers and getting your stories placed, the challenge of impacting this space is greater than it's ever been. The sponsorship world is changing as well, and sponsors today are expecting much, much, much more from their return, or from their investments. They're expecting much more in the way of return on their investments. Growth on sports sponsorship in North America continues to be relatively modest, about 4%. And a phrase that I learned during my time with the U.S. Olympic Committee, and it's really, really important, is sponsors today expect you to help them ring the register. And I know you all know this. The days of a sponsorship being defined by logos and signage are over. You have to think about sponsorship in terms of what can I do with my local club, with my local team, with my program to help sponsors see measurable, direct return on that investment that they've made in you, regardless of the size of the investment. If you'll permit me, I'm going to just reference a UNLV example here. And apologies, I got a bit of a scratchy throat today. We lead the world at UNLV in having sub-sandwich companies as sponsors of ours. We have 5 sub-sandwich companies that are sponsors of UNLV. We are fantastic for reasons I didn't quite understand, in attracting sub-sandwich companies as sponsors. We eat a lot of sub-sandwiches at UNLV, which is good. And I asked one of them, while eating a free lunch courtesy of them, if I'm honest, why they were so interested in sponsoring us, because the freight isn't cheap, particularly for what would seem to be a fairly modest-sized business, a sub-sandwich company in Las Vegas. And she said it had nothing to do, or very little to do, with the relationship with UNLV, which made me feel great, but had everything to do with the fact that we host a lot of events, and the expectation was we would encourage visiting teams to go to their sub-sandwich shop when they were in playing us for their meals. So the entire return on that sponsorship to Capriotti's, God love them, like you, name drop when you can. The entire return to Capriotti's is about us driving teams back to their shops when they're in town to play us. And because of our weather, particularly in the spring sports, we have a lot of teams from the upper Midwest and the Northeast who come out and see us in outdoor sports in particular. And we sell a lot of sub sandwiches for our official sponsors. So something for you to think about as you think about your own sponsorship proposition. I'm sure many of you host big meets over multiple days. When you think about the type of value you can provide to your sponsors, think about driving participants and their families back into their stores while they're out visiting you. It completely had passed us by, but now we understand that's a responsibility we have. So when we put together information for visiting teams, we include that type of stuff in there. I'm sure many of you are already doing things like that. As I mentioned, sponsorship today is no longer defined as being an exchange of logos and signage. It has to run much deeper. It's expected that you will help that sponsor make a connection with the consumers they need to reach. And one of the most important learnings for us has been that sponsorship decisions really at any level are no longer made singularly by our friend Matt Farrell, the Chief Marketing Officer with the company, with a local business. These decisions now oftentimes involve a Chief Financial Officer who will scrutinize the spend. They involve a board of directors or perhaps an audit committee who will vet the agreement before it's entered into. And many times the CEO will have a voice in determining whether or not a sponsorship is executed. And this isn't just for a major national sponsorship with USA Swimming or the US Olympic Committee. Going back to my sub-sandwich example in UNLV, a relatively modest fee as these things go, although for us it seemed like quite a big fee for this local shop, she had to take it to an ownership group to get it approved before we could actually enter into the deal. So this is happening at every level of sponsorship. When you approach a company about becoming a partner or sponsoring your local event, don't be surprised if that decision moves past the person you have a relationship with and gets into a finance committee, a boardroom, groups like that. It's not a bad thing, but it is very different from where we were even a decade ago. So, with all of this going on, how do we cut through it? How do we attract sponsors in this increasingly competitive and very, very cluttered landscape? How do we attract media attention in a landscape that is very different from what we saw 10 to 15 years ago? Newspapers going away, traditional media in the way we all knew it becoming extinct, vanishing. How do you land your message? How do you successfully bring sponsors on board and attract media? The good news, and it's very good news, is you have an extraordinarily strong hand to play. You have a much stronger hand to play than you probably realize. As I live in Vegas, by the way, it's a requirement that at some point in every presentation, either dice, chips, or cards are involved. So I can only go back to home if I put this in there. So, job done there. Here's a series of 6 suggestions. I tried to get to 7 again with Vegas, but I just sort of ran out at 6. So if this was a craps game, you wouldn't want me throwing the dice. But 6 tips that we would offer for you to think about. And I hope after this we can have a bit of discussion around these things to cut through all of this, to secure the type of media coverage your program needs and deserves, coverage that will ultimately help you grow membership, grow the sport, and also help you in attracting local sponsors and regional sponsors that you need to help your programs continue to grow. The first is, don't underestimate the value of what you have and who you are. The local and regional angle today from a media perspective is more valuable and has more resonance than it ever has. And the reason for that is the national guys, if you will, are going to do what they're going to do. If a local media organization of any kind is going to survive, they're not going to chase national news. They're not going to chase regional news. They're probably not going to chase state news. They will live and ultimately succeed off the back of local and regional stories. This weekend, very, very busy sports weekend, as you all know. Sweet 16, round of 8, down to the Final Four, NCAA championships in swimming, Frozen Four in hockey getting set, a lot of stuff going on. I did just a quick Google search over the weekend, just put the word swimming in, and two of the top searches, two of the top posts were local newspapers talking about the Central Wisconsin Boys Swimmer of the Year and the New Jersey Girls Swimmer of the Year. These stories cut right through everything that was going on with the NCAA Nationals in swimming, with basketball, with hockey. The young people who are in your programs are very, very, very interesting, and don't underestimate the appeal of those stories with local newspapers, local editors, local broadcasters. Be unique. Tell your story in a different way, and this was a real learning for us during my days with the U.S. Olympic Committee, and it took us some time to fully accept this, and it was so great to hear Lauren's presentation today because it's further validation or affirmation of something we started to do in partnership with NBC really around 2004, and it was a huge leap of faith. And the point of it was this: we started talking about our athletes in a very different way, and we fought it, we resisted it, but the fundamental premise was this: when an athlete qualifies for the U.S. national team or the U.S. Olympic team, or they win a state championship, the consumer, the general public understand that by definition, they're a really good swimmer. They get that. So rather than us spending all of our time talking about Michael Phelps first as an extraordinary athlete and an extraordinary swimmer, we had to begin talking about him in a very different way. And we had to start establishing what we called categories of connection. So we started looking at the athlete first as a person and then as an athlete, and communicating in that way. So we looked at what are their interests. Michael Phelps, the car enthusiast. Michael Phelps, the gamer. We looked at athletes who were involved heavily in cooking, athletes who were involved heavily in any number of activities. And we began communicating about that athlete directly with people who have an interest in that pursuit. And once we had them there, we started talking about that athlete as an athlete. But the conversation began in a very different way. We wanted to talk about the athlete as a person first, establish categories of connection with people who have similar interests, build that interest, and then expand that or capitalize that on a way where we could start telling the swimming story. We could start telling the Olympic story. NBC convinced us to take this approach. Really, again, in 2004, before Athens, we saw it work and doubled down on it going into Beijing. I think friends from the U.S. Olympic Committee and NBC would tell you that it has been fundamental to much of the rating success that NBC has enjoyed over multiple games now. The fact that the American public is connecting with and relating to athletes in a very different way. First as people who have interests that are very, very similar to their own, but then beginning to understand and appreciate what they're doing athletically as well. It wasn't an easy sell. I can tell you that there were some difficult meetings with NGB personnel who said, you are absolutely out of your mind. We're not going to do that. We're not going to not talk about the athlete as athlete first. But we got there, and I think it's been very, very successful. Access. And I know this is tough, guys. I know it's not easy, and we deal with it for good and valid reasons. We deal with it at UNLV as well, and we dealt with it here, and I know every one of you deals with it. But get comfortable, or try to get comfortable with providing more access. Tear down that wall and let them in, whether it's sponsors or potential sponsors, whether it's media. Let them in a little bit more than you might be doing today. The dividend will be tenfold. It's not always fun. They can be distracting. They can get in your business. But the benefit of allowing the media to have a deeper look at who you are and what you're doing, the benefit of allowing sponsors to get in and really touch your program and understand all about it, as I say, it'll be tenfold. Content is beyond king. It is absolutely everything. And there's a real trap around this, I think. And it is feeling like if you're not producing Emmy award-winning content, it's not worthy of being distributed. Absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong. Be your own news organization. Be your own content creator. Be your own editor. Be your own distributor. Again, if you'll permit me a little UNLV example, this one doesn't involve food, although most examples with me do. I started there a year ago and was talking with my communications team about the local television footprint. And I think you're probably going to find this in many of your markets as well. Most of our local television stations have done away with standalone sports reporters. So you still have sports in the evening news, but it's delivered by the news desk. So you don't have Chet Goodguy going out and covering sports in the way we all knew. And it's like, well, guys, how do we get coverage on local TV? Well, they just don't come out anymore. So they come to the games, but they don't really come out anymore. It's, well, that's not really going to help us sell tickets and attract sponsors and deliver value. So we have a tiny little one-person video team internally. We now go to all of our practices. We shoot practice. We shoot a few interviews. And 3 times a week, we package all of that up at no cost, and we send it across to the local television affiliates. And now they cover our practices because we're delivering that content to them. But that content, basic though it is being used by every television station in town because we're providing that to them. You're in the same position. You can do that same type of thing. And rather than relying on them to come to you, my suggestion, my advice is you go to them. Take your sponsors and the media to the deep end. And as we've talked about already, the sponsorship equation today is so much more than logos and signage, and the same with the media. It's about much more than that 5-minute interview poolside. They expect so much more. It's funny, we as Americans are, I think, quite rightly criticized about being a bit perhaps over-commercial, particularly in the pure British eyes where there's no commercialism around anything. Or at least they think very little, although I find it funny that all their soccer teams have logos all over them. There's billboards running up and down the pitch and falling over when somebody sneezes on them. But they are fascinated in Britain by the fact that we do interviews here as swimmers come right out of the pool, or as a basketball coach is leaving the court at halftime, or that we allow cameras in locker rooms. And one of the things that was fun for me to be able to do while I was there is help the organizations I worked with get comfortable with that. Guys, that's where it's all going. And it's not going to stop. Media and sponsors are going to expect more and deeper. And we all have to adapt to that and understand that the alternative is they'll simply take their attention and their resources elsewhere. Now, I'm one who thinks that's not a bad thing that we're allowing them in deeper. I think it has to be managed very, very carefully and thoughtfully. But as a trend, I'm here to tell you that's not going to change. And then the last tip I have for you is just what you've heard from a number of speakers already, and that is to experiment and adapt. Be aware of what's happening in our world today. It looks very different today than it did a decade ago. That 4-year-old will see a world that none of us could have imagined even a decade ago. That will profoundly impact how your programs look and operate, I think in a really good way, in an exciting way. It presents some very real challenges to all of us, particularly with sponsorship becoming that much harder to attract, spending being flat, scrutiny being through the roof, media dying, at least in the way many of us grew up and thought about it. But because of what digital and social does for you, you're in a super strong position. You're in a much stronger position than most segments of sport and society because you have a very compelling and important story to tell, and you can control it. You can manage that message. We last thought from me, and then I'm more than happy to take questions and to try to answer them. We were very concerned in London in the lead up to the London games about building fans, and we had. you talk about having no money. We were sub no money. But fan engagement was really important to us. We wanted to build fans, and we decided to get serious about digital and social media. We hired a young guy who rode his skateboard to work and was ridiculous and all that. And he and I, you talk about feeling old, but one guy and some pretty basic content, but a sustained commitment to it. We managed to build a following on Facebook across all digital and social, of 1.25 million fans across all digital and social. And Team GB became one of the top 10 sports brands on Facebook in the UK. Now, we were spending roughly $20,000 a year on this. We became a top 10 sports brand against all of those British football or soccer teams. Sorry, I'm on this side and call it what it is. All those British soccer teams, Formula One, rugby, golf, everything else going on over there with massive, massive budgets behind them. We had one guy, his skateboard, and a heck of a lot of imagination. We became a top 10 brand on Facebook just by committing to creating our own content. It was really basic stuff, but it cut right through. So with that, happy to take questions.